What is happening with the US market? We have SPY pulling back 10%, QQQ pulling back 13% in the span of 1 month. So, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the key dates that shaped this and all the events surrounding it. Let's start with February 20. So, markets pulled back after Trump announced new tariffs. He basically announced more tariffs on auto, semiconductor, lumber, and pharmaceutical industries. So, at the start of the week, investors were really strong and optimistic about the market, but this policy change basically shifted it back to trade risks. And Trump is kind of known for all of his tariffs, so the market is trying to anticipate his new tariffs. So, the S&P fell 0.4%, basically nothing, which broke the brief run to record new highs, right? And another thing that happened this day was Walmart gave weaker than expected forward guidance for its earnings. And it basically showed to consumers and the economy that the higher prices from tariffs can affect the consumer spending. So there were also no surprises from economic data, but the sentiment kind of changed to a sentiment of more fear. The week after, on February 27, the White House confirmed that 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada would begin the next week. So, up until this point, the markets were pricing in uncertainty, not necessarily that the tariffs would go into effect. Because the tariffs could be used as leverage tools to allow Mexico and Canada to basically control their border policies or immigration policies. And basically, the confirmation from the White House basically made investors really scared. So on this day, Nasdaq dropped 2.8%, and tech shares and tech companies like Nvidia and Apple led the decline. Although some companies reported good earnings, basically the trading and the markets kind of focused on the macroeconomics right now. So they focused on like tariffs and policies like that. And basically, this day was basically the day that most investors consider the start of the decline, like the start of like something out of the ordinary, out of the normal day noise, and this is where the decline started. And a few days later, on March 3 and March 4, new tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico officially took effect. So, this also coincided with the time that the ISM Manufacturing Index would release their data, and it was released at 50.3. Now, take note, neutral growth is at 50, which means if it's at 50, it is not growing at all. Now, the fact that it's only at 50.3 demonstrates like the manufacturing is literally not growing anymore, and this is really bad, and it's one of the weakest readings we've got in recent months. So basically, investors were trying to figure out if the tariffs were actually affecting it or if this was like a slowdown due to the interest rates being high for too long. So with this data and the tariffs actually taking into effect, the S&P fell 2% and the Nasdaq dropped almost 3%, nearing the official correction territory term, which is at 10%. And on March 4, tariffs were expanded to Chinese goods. So now it's now the market is pricing in like any country can be tariffed, not just Canada and Mexico. So the market is very scared right now. So, and the worst part is these China, Canada, and Mexico also announced their own counter tariffs to the US ones. So it basically shows that the US problem is now becoming an international problem. So before, when technology was leading losses like last month, now it's more like the entire market is losing. So like financial, retail, industrial, everything is going down. And apparently, businesses also started speaking out more openly about like supply chain issues and the rising costs of raw materials. And this day basically stood out because like March 4 basically stood out because it shows that the effects of the trade policy are not like, oh, I'll announce tariffs and that's it. It shows like that there is real data, there's real effect to these tariffs, and that's what the market was scared of. So S&P dropped 1.2% this day, so straight back to back downs. So 2 weeks later, at the Fed's scheduled meeting, it basically kept the interest rate unchanged from at 4.25 to 4.5%. So the policymakers in the Fed also still projected 2 rate cuts. So they also raised their inflation forecast slightly because of these tariffs. And the chair, Jerome Powell, basically said that the Fed is taking a wait and see approach, which basically showed that the views were mixed in the committee. Like, some people thought that they should cut, some people think that they should keep it the same, some might even think raising rates. So the message perceived by the market was balanced. And the most important thing about this day were there were no surprises. And this is what the market loves. The market loves when there is no uncertainty. They love a market that is the same. They don't want any surprises. They don't want any unexpected events. So because of this, S&P 500 and Nasdaq both rose 1.1 and 1.4%. So this is basically one of the few days where the Fed policy, the expectations, and the markets all moved in the same direction. Now, this optimism from the Fed meeting was about to utterly disappear, and you'll see why in a bit. On March 28, PCE, which is the measure for inflation, came out. So new data from PCE inflation on March 28, which is the Fed's favorite measure of inflation, rose at the fastest pace per month in over a year. And consumer spending was also way below expectations. This report basically showed that price pressures were rising even as demand started to weaken. This is an example of cost push inflation. And cost push inflation is basically when inflation is caused not by demand but by supply chain issues. And this is a very bad sign. This is the bad inflation, and this is the inflation that is hard to control. Investors basically now worried that the economy might face slower growth and higher prices. So the S&P fell 2% and the Nasdaq fell 3%, almost 3%. And by the end of the day, the S&P lost 5% for the quarter, and the Nasdaq posted the worst quarterly performance since 2022. Now, I might have said 5%, but by the end of the month, if we look at SPY's top, the very top, on February 19, all the way to now, we're down 9%. SPY is down 9% in just over a month. 9% down. And QQQ, it's even worse with QQQ. Like, it's actually crazy. From the all-time high, we're down 13%, and that's in 37 days, not including the weekend, including the weekends. So that's crazy. That's just absolutely crazy. And April is just going to be even